Hey, everybody. Welcome back for a very special episode of the Awaken Way podcast. My guest today is someone you very likely know, but may not know her whole background unless you've watched her most recent podcast. We're going to go on a journey from stardom to science to spirituality with Mayim Bialik. Let's bring her on screen now. Hi, Mayim. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for having me on your show. That's what inspired me because, in all honesty, I never watched TV in the 80s or 90s or beyond. I'm not a TV watcher. So I'm much more interested in the science and spirituality side of your work, but fascinated by your previous life.
I've had quite a journey.
You have. And that's why I don't like to read people's biographies at the beginning. I'd rather have you tell us in your own words how you got from there to here. What inspires you to talk about regarding your background?
Gosh, I don't think I've ever had it framed that way for me. Um, um, my parents are first generation Americans, and that really kind of feels like the start of my story in many ways. So my grandparents were Eastern European immigrants, and yeah, I was raised by first generation Americans who were kind of transplanted New Yorkers. I was raised on the West Coast in Los Angeles. I was born in San Diego, but I was raised in Los Angeles. Went to public school. My parents were public school teachers with a combined 70 years of service as public school teachers. And I started acting in middle school, and I was cast in a movie called Beaches,
May
playing a
I
young
interrupt
Bette
here?
Midler.
I want to ask you about that. Was that something where your parents saw an opportunity and pushed you in that direction? Did you ask for it?
No, I was like that kid who liked being in school plays. My parents were not industry people. My dad was a drama teacher, but he wasn't my drama teacher. And my parents were documentary filmmakers. They made anti-war films in the 60s, so they came from a different aspect of the industry. But no, I was a kid who really believed that my comfort level on stage is something that should be explored. And so, yeah, kind of accidentally, about a year after I started acting, I was cast playing a young Bette Midler in Beaches. And after that, I was given my own TV show, which felt as crazy as it sounds. And from 14 to 19, I was on Blossom. And that was an NBC, primetime show. After Blossom, I went to college. I went to grad school. I was out of the industry pretty much for 12 years. I did my undergraduate degree in neuroscience with a minor in Hebrew and Jewish studies. And I went straight into a PhD program at UCLA in neuroscience. I had my first son in grad school. He's now 19. And I took my doctoral hood pregnant with my second son, who's almost 17. And I studied obsessive compulsive disorder. I studied psychoneuroendocrinology. That's my field. And I returned to acting, and I played a neurobiologist on The Big Bang Theory, which I had never seen before. That was the most popular show in America at that time. And for 9 years, I raised my kids while also being on a sitcom. Um, I'm divorced. I've written 4 books. Two of them are about the science of puberty. Those were New York Times bestsellers. They're called Girling Up and Boying Up. I wrote a cookbook. I wrote a book about parenting. And yeah, my return to acting was very unexpected. And I did not anticipate being on another sitcom in my life, and I got 4 Emmy nominations. I hosted Jeopardy for 2 years. I got my fifth Emmy nomination for that. And yeah, I have a podcast about the intersection of science and spirituality. We talk about a lot of mental wellness. I'm a science communicator, and yeah, I'm a devoted mom, and I am a cat lover. And yeah, I do the podcast with my partner, Jonathan Cohen, and he has a dog, and that's kind of life. And I live in Los Angeles still.
I love that. That is such a great summary. Yeah. So you specialized in OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders. Was
hmm
that personal?
Um, it was personal, but that's not why I went into that field. To be honest, I didn't know I was a person who fit the diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder. I had a lot of interesting quirks about me, but in the 70s and the 80s, even in the 90s, it wasn't really talked about the same way that it is now. So I ended up studying obsessive compulsive disorder in a population of individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome. And so that's a syndrome of hypothalamic dysfunction. And if you are a neuroscientist who doesn't want to work with animals, there's only so many laboratories that work with humans. So I
Oh,
actually sort of didn't have a lot of labs to choose from if you want to work with humans for your doctorate. And so one of the labs was this lab specializing in syndromes of mental retardation, and in particular, Prader-Willi syndrome is a syndrome of hypothalamic obesity. So I kind of accidentally started studying OCD in this population because it was an arena that could be studied. And anybody who's done a doctorate in the sciences knows you have to come up with novel research, of something that hasn't been studied before. So that's how I ended up working in that population. But yeah, I was told by a psychiatrist who asked the right kinds of questions that I fit the criteria myself for obsessive compulsive disorder. And indeed, I definitely am on that spectrum. It does not impact my life the way a lot of people who have severe OCD do. But there's a lot of interesting features to me and the spectrum of chemicals that is me that
yeah.
that definitely fits the criteria. And I function fine with obsessive compulsive disorder, as many of us do. Many people on the spectrum have also depression and anxiety. And, like there's often a lot of overlap with a lot of these things. It can sometimes be hard to tell what's what. But my interest in it was more academic than personal, for sure.
Wow, fascinating. So now you have a podcast, Mayim Bialik's Breakdown, which I do believe is a double entendre.
That's right.
Talk about how that came to be.
Um, when the pandemic started, I had been in the process of thinking about trying to pitch a talk show about mental health. And at the time, nobody was kind of talking about this stuff on TV. And I figured I'd be a perfect person. I'm a science communicator, and I was on The Big Bang Theory playing a scientist. And it takes a long time and a lot of red tape to do a show. But at the time, my partner, Jonathan, was like, we should do a podcast. I said, I've never listened to one. I don't even know what that means. We should do a podcast. And literally, the pandemic hit and everything kind of shut down. And Jonathan said, we can still do a podcast even during a pandemic, which I thought, that sounds crazy. We're not supposed to do anything. And so we ended up outfitting a studio that was safe to do podcasting in. And we started podcasting. And what we realized was that for those of us who have, let's say, history in therapy offices, or we've been placed on medication for things about us, or we've talked about anxiety, the pandemic was still terrifying and scary. Like, what was going to happen? I don't know. Who do I trust? Do I trust the government? Do I trust this? And we realized if people like us who had a history of therapy and vocabulary around this, if we were feeling anxious, what about people who had no background in these concepts or even knowing what anxiety feels like in your body? I had so many people who said during the pandemic, I can't sleep and my stomach hurts. What's going on? I said, you're anxious. For those of us who've been anxious our whole lives, this is just standard issue. So we literally started the podcast to democratize mental health, to start teaching people the difference between anxiety and depression and panic, and really just trying to open conversations about what works for people and what doesn't. And by and large, the guests that we had on, experts, very famous celebrities, people with nominations and awards and success, so many of them had imposter syndrome. So many of them had fear that they couldn't describe. So many of them had challenges with drugs or alcohol or trying to fill that God-shaped hole, right? And so many people found a spiritual solution. So we started seeing that our conversation about mental health had so much overlap with conversations about the intersection of science and spirituality. And that's sort of where we've kind of navigated a lot more of our space. It's how we found you.
I love that. What is imposter syndrome?
Imposter syndrome is sort of that pervasive and clinically diagnostic feeling that you don't deserve the things that you have, or that people will find out that you're a fraud, or if people really knew who you were, they'd take away your degree, or you wouldn't have your job, or you'd lose your relationships. And it's something that, we've had many, many prominent celebrities on, people who have been in movies and TV shows and won awards. And almost all of them reported feeling, I'm still not good enough. I still don't have that success that I want. what if other people find this out about me? And we found that so interesting because, again, it's pretty consistent with what many of us understand from spirituality as you are loved. And as I get from your app and your work, what if you operated from a place of being loved and not needing to constantly fill that? And for actors, that's what we do, right? We spend our lives trying to fill that.
Yeah. So how have you personally evolved as a result of these conversations that turn spiritual?
Wow. I think that's been for me and Jonathan the most interesting and I think kind of gratifying part of what we get to do. A lot of people, I mean, nobody starts a podcast to get rich. That's not really what it's for, right? It's a conversation, it's a community building, and of course there are people who are able to monetize it and things like that. And of course we do run a business, as many of us who podcast do. But for us, the the conversations that we've been able to have, um, have inspired in us a different way, essentially, to run our business and to proceed with what we would like to share. And honestly, what we kind of feel we're here to do, right? Everybody has a purpose and everybody has a calling. And I was always told, by many mystical and spiritual people, like, there's a reason that you have a platform. There's a reason that you were given this. And I thought, I don't know what that means. And I don't know if this is it, but I do know that the work that we get to do, the people we get to speak to, um, we're not only helping people understand things that they may have thought were impossible or things they didn't believe in, right? We're also, providing a place and a community for people who always knew that there was something out there, right? Or people who had intuitive abilities or people who developed those abilities, as you help so many people do. We're happy to have kind of a quote mainstream platform with which to do that. And there are some people who don't quote need the science, right? They believe in it. They believe that there's something out there. They believe in God, whatever it is. But for us, we really enjoy being able to talk about the practical and measurable components of a spiritual experience, which mystics didn't need the science to prove it, but a lot of people, need to hear that. And I think that's what I've really gotten from the conversations we've had. And Jonathan just feels, completely validated because he's believed this stuff pretty much his whole life. And he's so grateful that we can share it in a way that is, in many cases, more accepted in the mainstream as ways to talk about it.
And you definitely do that. I remember being on your show, and at the end, I just thought, wow, I just feel like I was grilled for 2 hours in a positive way. But you were just like, okay, answer this, answer that. Now, how does that work? It was just boom, 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 very, very what's the word? It was practical and serious. That's it. It was the most serious interview I've ever done. Yet that what was fun for me was that my friends who watched it and reported back to me said the part they liked the most was, for example, when I would get snagged by my guides and you got all excited. You were like, oh, that's happening, right?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And
Tell me about,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I want to know, I don't want to make any assumptions, but now that you've gotten into the spiritual side of things and you're doing this podcast, talk to me about the satisfaction level of doing this work versus being an actor.
Wow. Really, really great question. I think, I spent 12 years in academia, which was such a difference from the industry. And in many ways, there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of ego. There's a lot of competitiveness. There's a lot of, women trying to find our place in places that historically we haven't been. So there was a lot of that in academia. But I really enjoyed, not being sort of, I don't want to say judged, but not being characterized by what I could offer you because of my humor or my talent, right? I liked being in academia because it allowed me at the time to be intellectual. What this phase of life has allowed is a real appreciation for not just the intellectual parts of me, but those deeper parts of me that many of us who are career oriented, especially those of us in the sciences, and indeed, high earning females. And, I've been divorced for 12 years. I've like been on my own in a lot of ways. So these aspects of me that I've gotten to explore, it's a whole other dimension, of understanding myself. It is it's a much deeper, and I don't want to say it's not gratifying, but it's a very challenging way to engage, because when you're a workaholic, which is what I've been for most of my life, you don't have to drop into your body, and your book was what really showed me there literally is a way to drop into your body. And I'm just used to operating above the neck. I just do
That was the
everything.
Awaken Way, the Awaken Way
Right.
book.
Yes. Everything that I've always kind of been taught to achieve has in some way been from the neck up. Being a mother is the only thing that ever felt like, oh, there's not even a book to read. Like the baby is the book, and I get to tune into whatever that maternal instinct is, right? But I never really connected it with all of the other kinds of instinct that we all have as humans. So this phase of life has really been about that. The last 5 years of my life have really been about that through a lot of different modalities. And I've tried a lot of different things to kind of encourage me to kind of drop down and be able to operate not just from the neck up.
What is your spiritual practice these days, if any?
Um, Well, I'm trying to separate my spiritual practice from my religious tradition. I was raised, very happily in a religious tradition, and I always believed in God. I was raised in a monotheistic religion. I was raised to believe not just there's only one God, because I think that's an oversimplification, but that there is one force in the universe that oversees all of humanity, not just the people that identify with my religious tradition, right? I was always taught there's one source, like source with a capital S. And so that was sort of the mystical, and liturgical tradition I was raised in. There's a lot of spiritual components to that. Um, and this understanding that I now have of the ways to sort of tap into my body, they're very consistent with, for me, my religious tradition and the spiritual tradition I came from, but it's a very different awareness. For me, I start every day with a scan, like literally checking in with my body to see where it's at. I do try and acknowledge a creator when I wake up first thing. Like, thank you for returning my soul to me. There's a Hebrew prayer that many of us were taught to say, and that's what we say, that you returned my soul to me faithfully every morning. I I do I do call on, I call it God. I don't really think about guides as much, but I do call on God not just in moments of distress or fear or anxiety, but I try and acknowledge goodness as coming from a source as well. I do have a need to check in throughout the day with my body, and to me, that's also, I guess, somewhat of a divine connection that I'm trying to make. And I practice mindfulness also at night. I do a meditative practice at night when I get into bed, and for me, that really is a request of the God of my understanding to help usher me into sleep. Sleep's really, really challenging for me. I have a very active mind, and it's been a real challenge. So I call on whatever's greater than me to parent me to sleep, to comfort me as a parent. So yeah, that's a little bit. I mean, I also like, I love crystals. I love special, pretty objects. I have, a collection of those things. Jonathan sometimes will indicate, which stones he likes for me, and he'll buy me those as well. But I wouldn't say I have a practice around those. But I think in general, a spiritual practice kind of final note is, to try and find places of connection in the world rather than divisiveness, whether that's with my kid, my cat, my home, my space, or when I interact with people, outside. Um, Kindness, literally acknowledging people that are not used to being acknowledged as you encounter them in the world, to me is part of, kind of a spiritual practice as well.
I love all of those answers. How you work it into your full day. Have you had, or can you share with us? Because I believe most of us have had what I, in my book that you read, The Awaken Way, call no other explanation moments. When you said, wow, there is something greater than just this and God?
I don't know if I love those stories, meaning when people have those kinds of moments.
Mhm.
And, for me, it feels very linked to my understanding of science, meaning just like I have reverence for gravity and the fact that we're not flying off this planet, to me, that's kind of one and the same with my faith and understanding of no other explanation. Like, that is the explanation. The explanation is I didn't create gravity and I can't control it. And sometimes there are things we don't understand about certain scientific or biological processes. To me, that is divine mystery. And I guess I feel some sort of comfort in that I don't have to figure it out. And the more I learned about the brain, the more I learned about the nervous system, which was my specialty, the more I felt like, of course, this is a divine set of processes that over hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands and millions of years have brought me to this moment where I'm learning this, or where I'm sitting with you right now talking on a computer that I think has to do with like a satellite, right? That's like beaming information around the world. Um, to me, that it's so inherently miraculous that I just kind of always had that sort of notion. And of course, I went through a period of like, there's no God. That was sort of, I think I had a brief phase maybe in high school. But what I like to say is I don't have to believe in God. I know that God believes in me. Like the fact that I'm still existing and thinking. And that's a mystical Kabbalistic concept that if God were to stop thinking about us, we would stop existing. And that's a beautiful scientific concept as well. If physics decided to stop working, we would all fly off the planet,
Yeah. I love how we all can have different concepts of all of this, yet there are certain points that are the same, and yet in the end, it doesn't matter, right? There will always be the mystery. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, how about the mystery of consciousness versus the brain?
Wow.
Yeah, as a neuroscientist, is the mind beyond the brain?
So when I was in college, there was a lab that I worked in, like, that was my research laboratory that I worked in. And we studied this in ways that I was really only beginning to understand. I worked in neuropsychology. I was trained in the lab of Eran Zaidel, who unfortunately passed away recently, and Marco Iacoboni. And these were neuropsychologists who were doing this kind of research. Can we find consciousness? How do we find awareness in the brain? Honestly, I've learned more, I think, from the guests that we've had on the podcast talking about a collective consciousness, talking about, sort of a more theoretical physics perspective on an existence of consciousness that clearly can be outside of the brain and the mind. And we actually recently, I was just thinking about you because we recently spoke to Angela Ford, who worked for 9 years as a psychic in the government, using her channeling and psychic abilities to spy. And remote viewing was something that apparently the government has no problem training people to do and using, while many of us are like, is this real? Is there consciousness?
Oh,
Apparently, this is
years.
some
Yeah.
right for years, for half a century almost, right? So, I think for me, that's been some of my favorite education because it's very different, when you get to sort of learn it by speaking to people who are experiencing it that way. Jonathan, my podcast partner, he's always felt that there's a collective consciousness. He studied the Akashic records, he has a lot more comfort with that. And I really cannot even wrap my head around it, in particular as a scientist. But I think I'm getting better at it. I'm getting better at understanding what it means that some people have special abilities and that allows them access to different aspects of reality, honestly.
My understanding is the brain is a filter, a reducing valve of consciousness. It blocks out what's out there. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting studies about an interesting downregulation that occurs in transcendental experiences. There's some really interesting research in psychedelic fields, because that is one of the ways that we can sort of try and quantify what's happening. And many people, even in these studies with psilocybin or with LSD, assume there'd be this upregulation, right? The whole brain's like going crazy and you're having all these crazy experiences. Turns out there's a downregulation, exactly what you said. There's a filtering that occurs so that what is sort of the actual reality, is how people kind of describe it, is revealed. And that
Yes.
people who have transcendental experiences are tapping into something that is not out there. It's actually in here. And the brain is kind of helping us function on a daily basis to open our computers and eat and, procreate and all the things that we need and get to do. But the brain is not necessarily useful for on the daily letting us access that. But there are people, you are one of them, who do have the ability to tap into that with a different kind of ease. And for many of us, we can live above the neck our entire lives and never learn to drop in. But I'd like to believe that some of us can also try and access that.
Well, I believe that it's exactly what you just said, that it's something that can be learned, because I didn't have it my whole life until I set the goal and trained myself.
Mm.
And that's why I'm so fascinated with neuroscience, because I learned that we have this default mode network. It's
Mm-hmm.
the hamster on the wheel, and we just run on habit. And the left brain does its thing and it dominates most of the time. But meditation dampens that
Yeah.
and activates the right brain. And when you get
Mm-hmm.
that balanced whole brain state, and there's a whole other world that reveals itself.
Yeah, and Jill Bolte Taylor, very famous, neuroanatomist who had her left hemisphere essentially shut down. She had a very significant brain event, as we say, and she had an active, I would say, conscious experience of living in that right hemisphere. And the right
Yes, yes.
hemisphere it's not just feeling, it's not thinking about feelings, it's an embodied sense of safety, goodness, wholeness. And that is exactly the state that we're trying to get to. And there's fascinating, imaging studies with yogis and monks who meditate and chant. And we can see that there really is an entraining that we can do of our brains.
That's why I was fascinated when you were talking about experiencing your body. And people might say, well, what's
Hmm.
the point of that? The body's the bridge to these higher states. We don't want to miss the body. It has a lot of messages for us.
Hmm.
So your show Breakdown deals a lot with emotional healing. Moving on to
Hmm.
different topic here. How does science and spirit come together with emotional healing as part of your goal there?
One of the things that I think surprises and disturbs people the most is the notion that the way that many of us are trained to understand healing is from a Western medical perspective. And it's actually only one perspective. And for thousands of years, other traditions have used other modes of healing that in our current description would be an understanding of the fusion between the spiritual and the scientific. It matters if you are part of a community that prays for you. Your immune system will upregulate or downregulate depending on how much you feel you are cared for. uh, People who get sick or have chronic sickness um, do have an ability to heal themselves. And just as we all know, negative thoughts can make our tummy hurt, right? They can give us a headache. Um, Positive thoughts can also impact our body. There is no reason to believe that only negative thoughts can impact your body and your ability to heal. And there's, an entire fascinating, field of research that's really trying to quantify this so that people can understand more what does it look like and what's happening in the body. Um, there's some controversial aspects to this. Gabor Mate in his book, The Myth of Normal, talks about how no one should think it's normal for so many people to get cancer in their 20s, right? Like we're hearing so many people who have colon cancer, things that doctors only used to see in people over 60 or 70, we're now seeing, in people in their 20s. Like, why is that happening, right? And obviously there's environmental components and there's diet, there's so many fascinating things. But one of the things Gabor Mate says is we are living in a culture of extreme stress and anxiety and fear and trauma. And it impacts the body. It impacts the body's ability to fight off normal mutations that happen, right? All the time in our DNA. Every time it replicates, there are boo-boos that we correct. But the notion that healing is in our hands is something that science is finally catching up to, which again, people have known for a very long time. And it holds a lot of promise. It holds a lot of promise because we don't have to think of ourselves as this binary system, right? That I go to the doctor when I'm sick, and then I go to synagogue or church, when I want something spiritual. It's all happening all the time in your body. And sometimes, sickness it's a message, right? And the question is, how do we respond to that message?
Well, I'm curious how you respond to the messages you get from your guests on the show. Have your practices changed over time then learning these things? Because, for example, you said my book, The Awakened Way, really gave you a lot of ahas and had the practical tools. But my book and other guests lead you to kind of say, hey, I want to try that. And then your life changes.
Yeah, I think, it's not a competition. There's a lot of podcasts out there and there's a lot of people, kind of in this space. Um, I think what's special, at least about us as we make our podcast, is we really do. We try all the things. We read the books, we do the research, and we try and see what resonates also with us because we see ourselves as on a journey, like a lot of people are. And when I get to speak to people like you, when I speak to people who have had their own journey and have the ability to then transmit that to other people, that's especially powerful because I have different abilities, right? But I have not been able to find sort of that one place in me that feels settled in terms of, understanding emotionally and psychically and spiritually where I'm supposed to go. So for me, I get to learn, from all of these incredible people. And the fact is, a lot of what we talk to people about is really mind-blowing for me. It really is. That's not performative. I give sincere and authentic reactions to things that absolutely blow my mind, and I'm no longer
Give
willing to
me a few
dismiss
examples.
them. I mean,
Give me a
just
few
thinking
examples
about
that blew.
you, I'm thinking about even you and Wolf and like these stories of synchronicity that kind of feels out of this world, right? Like that's astounding. And the fact that there are techniques and methods that, again, people have used for thousands of years, but that you're able to sort of encapsulate in ways that speak to people who do operate, like for me, from the neck up. That's really important because I don't think that this wisdom should only be saved for people on the fringes of the conversation. I don't think that these skills are things that we need to dismiss as freakish or it's not real or I don't want to talk about it. True scientific curiosity comes from looking at what's happening, coming up with theories and hypotheses, and seeing what resonates and what actually rings true and what actually is true. So for me, that's been really incredible to get to learn from all of these, amazing people. I just need a lot of reminders. I'm a fast learner and a fast forgetter.
Well, I have news for you, Mayim. I'm still blown. My mind is blown almost on a daily basis by what the spirit world pulls off. It's fun. It's
Mhm.
fascinating. I'm like you, like, let's talk about that some more. The one thing that concerns me about academia and science being so slow to catch on to the reality of the greater reality is people are afraid of losing their grants, right? Or how will
Mhm.
people look at me? I love your courage to get out there and investigate these things.
I mean, look, I appreciate that. And also, it is, it's really, it is a risk in many ways. for people in the hard sciences to engage this way. We've had a couple conversations about the telepathy tapes on our podcast, and we had Dr. Amir Raz, who's a fantastic neuroscientist, who really said, I have to go by the standards of scientific rigor, and this doesn't meet it. And then we spoke to Professor Scott Barry Kaufman at Columbia, a cognitive scientist, who said, I'm willing to engage in the scientifically rigorous conversations about this. And to me, it's so helpful. It's so helpful for everybody.
Yeah, I love those telepathy tapes. And you talked about Jonathan liking crystals, and you like crystals. I got these
I
spheres.
was looking.
And what was so encouraging for me was hearing the people with autism in the telepathy tapes get so excited about stones and have to be near them because they could feel the
I
vibration.
love that too. I just got chills.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ty said to me as he went out to get flowers for today, he said, the flowers look so good on your show. He said, couldn't we just pay for a really nice, beautiful artificial set? And I said, that's a great idea, honey, but it's about the energy, the life in the fresh flowers. And you could just kind of see him go, oh, people don't think about the fact that we radiate energy and
Right.
nature radiates energy, and the stones definitely have an energy.
Yeah,
but I
for
wouldn't have
sure.
thought that way in my military past either. Did you ever see this for yourself when you were on Big Bang Theory?
No, I mean, when you have young kids, which I did, I still had one child nursing when I was starting on the Big Bang Theory. So when you're at that phase of life, it can be very hard. There's so many moving parts. And, I was on Big Bang Theory for 9 years. And in that time, I got divorced. My father passed away. Life happened, right? Life was happening in all these different ways. I definitely was more, I think towards the start of Big Bang Theory, I was more observant in terms of Jewish ritual. It was just a time in my life when I was more observant. So I was kind of in touch with those aspects. But no, nothing, in my neuroscience training kind of prepared me for this level. Even though I worked in a lab that studied consciousness and I was learning about this stuff, um, you know, I, I I hadn't really gotten the opportunity to dip into this in ways other than the feeling I had in my heart. I'm one of those people who I'm very moved by prayer. I'm very moved by liturgy. I'm very moved by the intellectual understanding of, religious and spiritual tradition. So I guess I always knew that there was something in me that was drawn to that, but I didn't really have a mechanism for that and couldn't have imagined that.
I love that you pray and you understand the difference. I love that the difference it makes to pray. I
Mm-hmm.
love that you've combined prayer and your science.
Mm-hmm.
Your show is, Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is about helping people lead a happier and healthier life.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share any of the feedback from people about how to help them in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I should put a caveat, the word happiness can be very complicated for some people, right? But we love the idea of people seeing a life that they couldn't have imagined for themselves, whatever that looks like, right? Um, we hear from a lot of people who feel very seen, especially people who are on any various spectrum, meaning not just the autism spectrum, but people who are on the spiritual spectrum or people who are curious or kind of questioning about what's out there. Many people feel very, very seen, for lack of a better word. A lot of people do report that our explanations of certain aspects of mental health challenges have helped them have the language to seek more support and help. Meaning, a lot of people don't know how to articulate, what it feels like in their brain or their body when they're having a certain symptom, right? So, for a lot of people, they're happy to have that vocabulary. And for many people, they're having the kind of mind-blowing reactions that we're having as well, as we interview people. And look, there's, almost 2 million people on our YouTube channel. We have 85 million downloads. There's a lot of people, listening to what we do. And we've started doing more esoteric topics, and people are very, very interested in it. People are interested in what's the actual research into Is there life on other planets? Meaning, happy to have an alien conversation, but the conversation can also be that intersection of science and what can we even imagine, right? So a lot of people also really appreciate the ability to place that more rational lens on things that in many cases they knew had to be real, right?
That's
So
right.
I think we're kind of helping people, I guess, maybe bridge that a little bit. And also we're trying to be entertaining, meaning we want people to enjoy learning about this information. And we do really want to try and highlight the positivity, which is really hard, for people like me. I'm not programmed that way. I'm like,
Mm.
my friend Elizabeth calls it like a heat-seeking missile for the negative. Like that's a lot of how my brain was wired, right? And there's really interesting generational reasons for that. But the notion of focusing on positivity and focusing on love, like again, when I use your app, and when I go there, that reminder of like, what if I believe that I'm loved, right? That I'm safe and protected. Like that's missing from a lot of our lives, A lot of us are not programmed to think about that.
Yeah. If you don't know what she's talking about, go on your smartphone and look up Awakened Way. The app is free and it's a daily dose of positivity from the spirit world. Yeah. I
And
love
if you
it.
want to be, and I love to click on when I'm ready, like when I'm in a pickle, when I
Yeah.
really like feel stuck or when I feel scared, I click and I see whatever comes and I try and I look for the serendipitous things instead of saying, that doesn't apply to me. That doesn't make sense. This isn't relevant. I try and find the positive.
That's good. She's talking about the inspire button where there are over 6,000 messages in the archives. And if you ask from the heart, what do I need to hear right now? Or ask a specific question, you hit that inspire button. It is uncanny. Have you found that?
Oh yeah, I've had a few where it literally felt like you must have been in my journal the night before.
Well, there you go. There's your NOE, your no other explanation moment. I know it's something you have to go do, so I want to ask you a final question. I was watching a video of yours that you filmed 8 years ago about regrets. And you
Mm,
said there, I don't want to paraphrase it too much. I look forward to the day when I can look back and see all of my challenges as building blocks to something whole and complete.
mm.
I don't want you to have to be the day you die. How are you doing with that goal?
That's a great question. Definitely, makes me feel all sorts of emotions. I feel I'm closer to understanding the path for me now than I was 8 years ago. That's for sure. And I think part of that comes from it's a little bit of kind of a radical acceptance of the fact that there is a path for each of us. And we don't get to know what the really beginning, middle, or end is. We don't know where we're at on that path. And
Well, I would
all of
interrupt there and
our
say, yes,
yeah.
you can find that out in meditation and tapping into the
Mm,
greater reality. Your heart already knows it. So I just
mm.
plant that seed for you there. Because you're
Okay, I'll take that. I will take that and add that to yeah, the knowing, I guess, that I believe I have been building and as you just pointed out, still has some more building to do.
that we're works in progress or a process, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but the path you're on is beautiful, and many people would be envious of the fame, and yet you've shown people that it's not all icing, right? There's a lot of things going on in the
Just
depth.
we're just humans. We're all just humans, and every person that you see who's on a stage or on a screen, they had a story of how to get there. Their grandparents had a story. Sure, there's a lot of privilege, and people look at Hollywood and think like, oh, there's so much that's easy, but the fact is, when we close our eyes, we all go the same place at night. We're all the same. And when we pass, when we enter the next realm, we're all equal. And for me, that's where that comfort of that oneness comes in. That's the oneness. We're all one that way.
That's it. And you can close your eyes in meditation and start to experience that in between the times when you're sleeping. And I love
Yeah.
that your show has veered in that direction, and more people are coming to know that. Any parting words that you'd like to impart to the heart of our listeners?
Um, No, I'm really just so flattered that you wanted to talk to me. In many ways, I feel like I'm so new and just still learning. And I just have really enjoyed talking to you and just feel really, grateful that I got to meet you and learn from you and get to keep doing so and be part of your community this way.
Well, that's very sweet, Mayim, but I clap because I have a new term for you. So you may not be woo-woo yet, right? You're going in that, but that what you really are is new woo.
I like that.
Embracing it, right?
Yeah,
I
thank
do
you.
tell people that woo-woo is relative, and you have a very nice groundedness and willingness to be open to new
Mm,
things. It's beautiful. But thank you and Jonathan for what you're doing to help people understand who we really are.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I'll see you around maybe next week. Take care.